Well, it's Monday morning, February 24th, and we got transmission problems with the 900 again. Jared went to haul manure today, and the truck was making a little bit of a noise after he hooked back up to the trailer. We've just got done putting a little over $4,500 into this truck between front end alignments, front tires, new tie rod ends, muffler system, fifth wheel plate, new hub on the other side. There must be something else I'm forgetting, but at any rate, he said the noise that it's making sounds just like the noise from when the transmission went back in October. So I took a listen to it. I said, boy, that does not sound good. We pulled the oil plug out of it, drained the oil down, and we got a pretty good sized metal chunk on the drain plug. So we're going to pull the PTO off. We're going to start there. We're going to see what we can see up inside the transmission. Then there's a 6-bolt cover on the side that we can see in there. There's nothing going on with the clutch. It's all back in the transmission that's making noise. So we're probably going to more than likely have to take transmission out unless by chance it's the PTO, but I don't think it's going to be that. So we're going to proceed on with working on this truck. Well, we're hoping that we've got the problem figured out. We ended up dropping the PTO out of it, and we've got a bearing gone on this PTO. Now this is what drives the hydraulic pump on the truck. This gear here runs against the gear on the transmission that turns all the time, and this bearing on this one side here is gone. However, we've got some teeth missing out of the gears on the PTO. Now there doesn't seem to be any teeth missing on the part that drives the PTO from the transmission. So like I said, this gear here runs against the gear on the transmission. So what we're going to do now is we're going to roll the transmission over, and we're going to check all the gears in the transmission. And we're just hoping that none of these pieces got up into the other gears of the transmission. So we're also going to have to run a magnet through the transmission case to make sure we've got all these pieces out of here. So we're going to roll the transmission around, and then I'm going to go and get some parts for this PTO so I can rebuild it. It might be cheaper to replace the whole PTO because I'm going to need the drive gear set, and I'm going to need the driven gear set, because these this shaft here this gear here that's down in there, once this shifts over, the shift fork is right there. When you apply air pressure, it pulls that gear over inside the PTO, and then that's what spins the pump gear, the pump driven side. So let's roll this transmission over by hand, and hopefully we don't find any missing pieces off the gears in that transmission. Well, we ended up looking up into the transmission best we could, and the gears seemed fine. So all the damage seemed to have stayed in the PTO. There was some pieces of the PTO bearing up in the transmission case. There is some magnets in the transmission, so the magnets have caught some of the stuff, and it looks like there's a bunch of junk down in the bottom of this PTO gear case itself. So I'm going to pull the K flange off of the PTO. That's the flange that the pump itself bolts to, and then we're going to pull the shift cover off and get all them pieces out of there, and I'm going to see what the shafts are like. A lot of these parts in these PTOs, by the time you start buying all the parts to rebuild what you have, you end up having just as much money as if you bought the whole unit itself. Now, basically, there's two kind of PTOs that get sold around here, Muncie and Chelsea, and it looks like this one is a Chelsea PTO. It looks like it's red. I don't know. If it was blue, it'd be a Muncie PTO. But at any rate, we're gonna denut this and get it apart and see what the shafts look like. The shafts might be okay, and just have to replace the gears, and who knows what I'm gonna end up doing here. All kinds of pieces that we're finding all thrown around. Now this shift, this is the shift fork itself, and then that is spring loaded to hold the gear in neutral, and then when you apply air it pushes this over. But I couldn't get much movement out of it, and I didn't know if there was pieces caught in there. But that's out, and then I could see a bunch of pieces down inside here. So we've got to get just some other essential parts off in here. There's that guy, and then of course all my pieces are inside now. There should be a snap ring on here. Snap ring in there. I gotta get that snap ring off. Alright, so here is the driven gear here, and there is the one bearing that was good, and then the other bearing, this has got quite a bit of pieces and stuff. The rest of it is down inside here, so we've got to try to get this guy here apart. That bearing, which is still in good shape. Now, alright, so basically, yeah, the splines are shot on the inside of that. So we need this gear here, which is the gear that the fork slides on, and then this will run this over into this gear, which this gear is on the transmission. This one spins all the time, and then the shifting fork, it's sitting in the PTO like this. When the shifting fork shifts it over, it ends up shifting it over into this one, and then this is what drives the pump on this side. So what we've got here is an empty case, and I just dumped out all the metal that was in it, and this is the rest of it. So there is all of the pieces that come from the bearing. So we've got all this material here. This here is the bearing, and whatever pieces of the gears that decided to destroy themselves, and then I had some other pieces on a rag here. So here's all the various pieces right there. Here we go. So those are the pieces to the bearing. So we're going to clean this stuff up here, and I'm just going to go get a new PTO. We could price out these parts, but PTO is $600-700 is all. And yeah, this shift cover, I think there's stuff inside that air cylinder too. And yeah, I'd rather have a new PTO, because next time that PTO goes, it could throw pieces up into the transmission. So let's go and get a new PTO, and we'll get this thing back together. Alright, what we have is all our parts laid out for the PTO here. And if we were going to rebuild this PTO, we would need this gear here. This is the one that runs up against the transmission and runs all the time. This one here is where the pump comes in the back side of the PTO. This is what runs the pump. This is a 7/8 spline here. Then you got your end covers. This is the cover that the pump bolts to. This is the cover on the opposite side of the pump. So here is the bearing that runs on this shaft right here. And this shaft comes across the top of the PTO like that. And then this is the rest of the pieces to the one bearing, and then this is the bearing on the opposite side. So we've got 4 or 5 of these little guys missing. They're in the transmission back farther. There's a couple of magnets already in there, so I'm suspecting that they're stuck to the magnet. That should be okay, but this gear is going to have to be replaced if I rebuild it, along with this one, 2 bearings. So essentially everything that you see here is the inner part of the PTO, and that would all have to be replaced. It got into the case a little bit right here, and this shaft here is decent, but this other side where the bearing runs on is, this side ain't scored up too bad, but this side here is all scored up, and this is where the cover comes up against, so it's not going to seal there. It's just going to leak oil. So basically everything you see from here over, from the left to the right, would have to be replaced, and that's going to exceed the cost of that PTO. So we're going to get off and grab a new one. Well, we're on our way back from picking up the PTO. I've got a MUNCIE PTO that I ended up getting from Fry the Wheelman. That cost me $650, along with a pail of synthetic transmission fluid. That was $180. So all in all, $830, I guess it is, for this repair job. But we're going to be back to the shop in a little while. I ended up taking the parts that went in that other PTO. I dropped them off to them, and I'm going to see if I can get that one rebuilt, just so I have it for a spare. We had a spare for a while, but I ended up using that up a while ago, and we were thinking about switching over to a faster run PTO. In other words, we were going to change the ratio on the PTOs that we run on the trucks, but I kind of decided against that just because we'll end up wearing hydraulic pumps out. What that means is the PTOs, you can get them geared to run faster or slower than engine RPM. So the PTO that we're running right now on the W9 is running at 112% of the engine speed. So at engine speed, it's running 12% faster than what the engine's turning. So we'll be back to the shop here in a little bit. We'll slam this PTO up on there, get some oil in that transmission, and roll the W9 out the door. Hopefully there's not any other noises coming from that transmission. Again, we can't see back inside that transmission far enough to make sure that it didn't hurt any of the other gears. I didn't see any marks in them, but that doesn't mean that a piece didn't end up flying out and getting caught in the gears on the back side. Now there's magnets in this transmission, so any pieces or anything like that that is floating around inside that transmission, it'll end up catching them pieces anyways. I cleaned off what magnets I could reach, but the other magnets are back farther, and I couldn't get to them. So let's get back to the shop and get this PTO in place, put the gear pump back up on there, and we'll finish this job up. Alright, that stuff that I painted on the gaskets is just Permatex Forma gasket. You probably really don't need that stuff. It helps the gaskets to kind of stick together while you're installing the PTO. And another thing that it assures you is when you go to take that PTO off, you really got to scrape the gaskets to get them off, because they don't want to come off. What they give you with these PTOs is they give you a gasket kit. You got to put at least 2 in, and then the third one is just an extra, and that is a shim, what they call a shim gasket. And you can also get more gaskets to a kit if your gears mesh tightly. So I had the shift cover off. I already bolted it up in there, and I wanted to make sure there was enough of a gear lash. In other words, you want to make sure the gears kind of float and that they're not mashed right into each other solid. You want a little bit of a gap there so that when things heat up and expand, you're not mashing this gear right here so hard into the transmission that it ends up screwing up your PTO. Now this gear here runs all the time. And then the shift collar is on this part of the gear right here. So this is spinning all the time. And then when you air shift the PTO, there's a fork in there. And what it'll do is it'll pull this collar over, and it matches these splines up with the gear that's running all the time. And then that ends up turning your output part of the PTO to turn the hydraulic pump, which is going to bolt on the back side. So before this gasket maker ends up getting dried on there too much, we better roll in and get this slammed up into the transmission. Then we can get oil in there and put our gear pump on. What I'm going to have to do once I get that gear pump on there, being that this is not a Chelsea PTO, I'm going to have to make up a different hanger bracket for the gear pump. So let's go ahead and get this in underneath the truck. Okay. You might need some help with that PTO. You need help? Nah, I should be all set. Okay. Okay, there's that, and then Alright, so the PTO is all mounted. And then what we've got is we've got the shift cover off in here. Hey, you, Roger?
It's me, Andy.
So we've got the shift cover off. And then you can see this one is got a slightly larger set of bearings in it. And the output shaft is a little bigger. But the only drawback with these MUNCIE PTOs is this housing and everything is aluminum. And I'm pretty sure the Chelsea is cast, but it doesn't matter. I've seen them both fail, and I've seen them both be really good. So this is the gear here that runs up against the transmission, and then here is the shifting collar that I had talked about before. And then this is going to ride back here when it's in neutral. And then this one is going to be spinning all the time. And then when you air shift the PTO, it's going to slide that gear over, locking up the back end of the PTO so that it can rotate. The part of the shaft that's going to run the pump. Now the pump bolts on to this part of the PTO right here. So this is a 7/8 spline hub with a K flange. So we'll get this shift cover on there, and then we're going to pour the oil in it, run it, make sure it doesn't make any funky noises, and then we'll put the pump on. Alright, we've got shift cover in place, air hose hooked up, the wire for our light indicator that tells us the PTO is on, that's hooked up, oil is in it. Now we're just going to let it run for a minute before we put the pump on there and make sure everything sounds somewhat normal. Sound good? Yeah. Alright. We can reassure ourselves that that's all we have. Alright, now we can just slam this pump in there. I don't hear any noises, so that's a good thing. Just gonna pull some of this grease back in this spline hub, so when we put our pump in there, we've got a lubricated shaft. So, let's see if we can't get this guy up on there. That's a heavy bastard. Come on now. There. Okay. Now, this. I've got to take the pump bracket off in here. I got to turn the pump a little bit, and then I can put my bolts in. So, yeah, I've got to get this cob job off in there. So, this PTO is different, so it's actually back a little farther than the other one. So let's get our half-ass bracket off in there. Alright, so we've got the pump installed. That's right here. That's bolted to the PTO. There's just 2 half-inch bolts on either side. And then what we have to do, because this pump is so heavy, we have to bolt it to the back of the transmission. So this PTO is slightly different length from here and there. So we've got a bracket that's going to go into the pump, and then we just got to weld a little nub on here so that it's just got a little bit of stabilization, so it's not falling off in here. So I'm going to get that like this, here, there. Here's my bracket. I'll set that up in there like that. Put the bolts back in here somehow. I think I got to cut a little bit more off. Not quite. It should. I got to cut a little more off of here. So I'm going to cut that out like that. Well, that's going to wrap up this job here. The PTO is installed. The transmission's full of oil. We've got the pump in place. Oil's turned back on. The air lines are hooked up. And we got nothing leaking, so that's a good thing. Sometimes you run into trouble with these gaskets on the bottom of the PTO, but of course we've got gasket shellac and everything else on there, so there's one sure thing about using that. Oh, that gasket sealer stuff there, the old gaskets don't ever come off. But everything looks like it's good to go there, so we're going to roll out from underneath this old girl. Jared will be able to run this tomorrow. So we got everything all buttoned up here, and that is going to do it for this project. We'll get this back hauling manure. Jared, he ended up hooking it to the damn tanker this morning, and he fired up the fan on the tanker, and once he fired the fan up, he was walking back to the truck, and he just did not like the sound of the noise that was coming from the transmission. Pushed the clutch in, noise went away. So he says, you know, this sounds like the same frickin' noise from back in October. Jared ended up putting a new transmission into this back then, and we thought we were having the same problem with it. Drained the oil out, saw the pieces on the oil plug, which there's a magnet on the drain plug itself. Then we took the PTO off, and then we seen what we had for problems. We feared for a little bit of a minute that the pieces that had come out of the PTO, the bearing, the pieces of the gears and whatever, we worried about that going up into the transmission, but it looks like all the gears are fine in there. There is several magnets placed throughout the transmission, and they should collect anything that we didn't already clean out of there, and just hopefully we don't see any problems. But with that being said, that is going to do it for this video. I want to thank you for watching. Remember to leave a thumbs up, drop a comment down below, and we will catch you at the next video.